welcome back to Authenticity Speaks. My name is Trista. I am the host of this podcast. Guys, I am struggling. Let me tell you about the journey this specific podcast has gone on. Last week I recorded this because I was in my feels and I was like, I have a lot of stuff to say about this topic in particular. And I was really excited to share it. But then as the week went on, I was like, I was definitely in my feels. And I want to have a little bit more of an upbeat attitude with this podcast because it can be really hard to be happy talking about shame. So that was number one. And then I deleted it. I regret it because re-recording it has been a journey. I started recording it maybe 6 times today and it wasn't working. And then when I was 30 minutes into this episode, the last time I recorded, the pod track died. So I lost all of that. So I'm re-recording this again. I also recognize about myself that I am not, in fact, a one-hit podcast wonder. I can't just record because I mess up a lot. The woes of a podcaster life now. Anyway, I have new batteries in my Zoom pod track. I figured out the mic issue that I was having last week. It takes 3 weeks to make a habit, and this one just challenged me a little bit. And it may come out a little later than normal. So just, bear with me, and thank you for listening. Let's start. First of all, I am addressing my clients that I see for therapy, in particularly right now. I think it's important that we respect our therapeutic relationship, meaning we need to make sure that we are not going to do anything to affect how you view me as a person. Because, again, I am there for you. So, if you are listening to this and feel like I might say something that will impact the relationship that I have with you, please keep scrolling. I think the only thing that would put you in that position on this podcast in particular will be me sharing personal experiences and maybe personal opinions about things. Otherwise, move right along. Okay, with that being said, without further ado, let's jump in to the topic today, which is about self-esteem and shame resilience. Now, the biggest person I want to give a shout out to is Brené Brown, who is a very famous, well-rounded, amazing social worker who's done a lot of research into this topic. So a lot of my ideas and a lot of the things that I am telling you is just based off of what she has put out in the universe. So I'm putting that out there because this is not an original thought. This is something that I have learned and kind of created a small little curriculum based off of. So please go with that. So Brené Brown is well known for her work in self-compassion, self-esteem, just improving yourself. She has the 4 steps or the 4 areas of shame resilience that I'm going to get into, but I really want to start out with what self-esteem is. Self-esteem is based on how we see ourselves. It's our strengths and our limitations over time, and it's how we think of ourselves in a larger scale of the world. So when I think of self-esteem, it's a lot of people are how I feel about myself, right? It's my strengths, I feel good. A lot of people refer to a lot of different parts of themselves when referring to self-esteem. It's a really big word and we can honestly break it down. Now, when it comes to shame resilience, and the reason I'm bringing up self-esteem in the first place is, to me, shame is the opposite of self-esteem. If I'm having a shame about something, then I am not feeling the best about myself, which is what, the definition says. It's how we see ourselves, our strengths and our limitations, right? It's how we view ourselves positively. So shame is a really big part of that, and I'll get to that in a second. But, as a mental health therapist, I'm really into our brain, some of our thoughts, cognitions, beliefs, etc., how it works. What I thought was interesting is that brain scan studies demonstrate that when our self-esteem is higher, we're likely to experience common emotional wounds, such as rejection and failure, as less painful because we bounce back from them more quickly when we have higher self-esteem. That's crazy, guys. I mean, I'm not surprised, but that's crazy. Our self-esteem is higher when we feel better about ourselves. I think that's something pretty common that we can all relate to. We're also more resilient when we have higher self-esteem. And it's like, well, if I'm feeling shameful, how do I get out of that? How do I pull myself out of that? We kind of talked last week about shame. Well, I mean, how to be resilient, basically, in strengths. But again, shame resilience is one of the number one keys that we need to focus on to help our self-esteem. Of course, our strengths, but yeah. We also release less cortisol in our bloodstream when we're under stress. So that doesn't make any sense. We release less cortisol into our bloodstream. What did I write down? I think I'm supposed to say we release more cortisol into our bloodstream when we're under stress. And if we are more resilient, that's what I'm trying to say. Guys, see? It's been crazy. Let's try this again. We release more cortisol in our bloodstream when we have stress in our body. So if we are more resilient, we release less cortisol in our body. Therefore, our body is healthier. So that's why it's so important to understand how to be more resilient to shame. So let's kind of get into it and the different steps on how to be shame resilient. The first step is understanding shame triggers. Shame is a full contact emotion, which means we feel it not only mentally, but we feel it physically as well. It floods us with that feeling of fear and blame, and we don't always know what we are feeling as shame because you react to it in so many different ways. One of them being lashing out to the people around you, right? That's usually something that people experience when there's anger, and so people don't always identify it as shame. But shame is a full contact emotion. Sometimes shame feels like stomach tightening and nausea and shaking and heat and wincing and chest pain. And shame can be a lot of different things. I think a lot of people relate shame to embarrassment. That's kind of the closest that I can really think of it being. But the idea is to learn how to recognize it, right? And learn how to recognize its triggers. Shame is an unwanted identity. Therefore, it's characteristics that undermine our vision of our ideal selves. These can come from family, media, social groups. An example of this that I can really think of in terms of an unwanted identity is like, I don't know, somebody who is poor. Let's put that out there. Nobody really wants to have that, but when people around us, let's say you're in like the middle class and a group of people are pretty shameful that you're around and they mention, if you're poor, you're not good enough to hang out with us. I honestly don't know people like that in my life, but I do know that there are people like that that exist. That's an unwanted identity. So it kind of creeps in our own head of, oh, this is shameful. It's an unwanted identity. This is not something that I want. So I'm going to do everything in my power not to feel that. But then if you start being poor, all of a sudden you start feeling shameful. I hope you guys are following, but that's kind of the idea. We can also think of unwanted identities as understanding our vulnerabilities. This leads to shame resilience. You can resist letting those unwanted identities take hold and hurt you as much, right? When we understand our vulnerabilities, we have power over them. So if we are shame resilient, we can have power over those shameful areas. Okay, let's jump in. I keep sighing. I'm not bothered. I think I just have recorded this so much today that I'm like, all right, we're finally moving on. Anyway, so let's talk about vulnerability really quick. Shame and embarrassment, those can feel like very vulnerable and as a sign of weakness. But really, if we look at it, being vulnerable and having shame and talking about these things is the biggest sign of courage to me. Vulnerability is not a weakness, because if somebody has the guts to talk about this, to bring it up, that shows courage. That does not show vulnerability. If people use it against you, yeah, I could see how that could be vulnerable. However, you have to recognize, right? Like, well, I mean, in the steps I'm going to tell you about how to avoid putting yourself in a situation where somebody's going to use your quote unquote vulnerability against you. But yeah, anyway, so there's 13 main areas of shame. If you look this up on the internet, usually people say 12, but I split 2 of them up because they are not the same. In my opinion, one can exist without the other, and I'll tell you which ones they are. So let's start. The first one is parenting. Everybody has an opinion on how to parent children. Like, the amount of articles that contradict each other on the internet, or when people post about their lives on the internet and the people start to shame about parenting. Parenting is one of the number one shame triggers that I deal with. Like, am I actually doing what's best for my kid? Because Joe Blow tells me that I'm not, and I'm worried about it. So parenting is number 1. Number 2 is body image. I think this one is pretty self-explanatory, especially when the confidence things come, right? There are areas of our bodies that a lot of us look at a lot. Body image, how we look, how we present ourselves, that's a really big shame trigger. The third one is family. I can go a little bit more in depth about family in another podcast episode, but I think when people feel shameful about their family, it could be their family's traditions or cultures or values or a lot of different things. These are the 2 that I split up. So 4 is money, 5 is work, and I'll tell you why I split them up. You don't necessarily have to work to have money, or you don't necessarily have to be shameful about work to be shameful about money. I don't know. I just contradicted myself, but 4 is money, right? So if I'm feeling shameful about money, it could be finances, it could be debt, it could be all of those things, and that doesn't necessarily have to mean your job, right? But yes, money is a big area of shame, because if people feel like they have some sort of financial inability to maintain their life, that could be a big trigger. 5 is work. So this is like what type of job I work at. I know for me, I want to work at a job that respects my values, and I'm pretty shameful if a job doesn't align with who I am. And I know a lot of people would feel the same way as well. So work, that is one of them. 6 is mental health. So feeling shameful, maybe if somebody has schizophrenia or some sort of like narcissistic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder. If I really think about it, there might be some attention needed there. I don't know. But it's just an example. 7 is physical health. So, guys, I may have lost a lot of weight, but I still feel pretty shameful when I walk up those stairs and I'm like, God damn, I'm out of breath. You know what I mean? Physical health, if how our body is moving, how our body is feeling, that can be very shameful. This also can relate to like sickness, right? If I'm, if I have like cancer, or if I have an autoimmune disease that may hold me back, that can be shameful as well. And I'm just putting it out there. I don't think cancer or an autoimmune disease will hold somebody back. All I'm saying is some people may feel shameful when it comes to talking about those things. Anyway, 8 is sex. This one is not really surprising to me. There could be a lot of shame areas with this one. For me, being in Utah, a lot of shame can exist because people are having sex out of wedlock, or there could be a lot of shame about not having sex until they're married and then not knowing how to have sex. And then there's the areas of like, I'm not able to get it up and I'm not able to satisfy my partner. There's a lot of sex shame. So I'm not as surprised about that one, but also it's understandable why that is so shameful. 9 is aging. I'm 28. and I'm noticing the signs of aging. And although I'm not feeling shameful of it right now, I know that when I get older, I definitely could feel shameful. So that one is not surprising as well. Especially like people who age, they feel like they can't do what they once used to be able to do. And so that can feel really shameful as well. 10 is religion. So am I in a religion? Am I out of a religion? Do I connect with the religion I'm in, right? Religion is a big one. And we can also group in spirituality with that as well. If somebody is feeling spiritual, but they don't want to align with their religion anymore, but they want to be spiritual, that can be pretty shameful leaving their religion. 11 is being stereotyped and labeled. I think this one is pretty common. Not wanting to be the person that you look like, or I don't know, for me it's like the perfectionist, right? Stereotyped and labeled. I get that a lot. 12 is speaking out. This one is what really triggered me last week, and my shame trigger of speaking out, and I'll get into that and what I've learned these last couple weeks. Speaking out can look like speaking out for somebody else, or having a different opinion as somebody else, or not understanding everything. Speaking out is a big shame trigger. The last one is surviving trauma. I think trauma looks various different ways. It's not just about domestic abuse. I'm going to put that out there. But surviving trauma can look like domestic abuse. It could look like a car accident. It could look like, with all these plane crashes, a plane crash, right? Surviving trauma looks different for everybody, but it still can be a shameful topic to talk about. Okay, so now that we've identified all of the shame triggers, it's important for us to know that this is only the first step, and this may take some time. If you are like, well, I identify with all of them, so how can I be shameful about everything, right? You can also try scaling them, so writing all the 13 areas down and then each one give a scale from 0 to 5, like 0 being not shameful at all, and 5 being feeling the most shame I've ever felt in my entire life. And then rating each one to see which ones you have to work on versus the other ones that maybe aren't so prevalent to you. But even when I look at this list, I can really name off the ones that are very upfront for me. So that's something that you can do personally as this first step in identifying shame, or having shame resilience. That's what I meant. So you identify it first. The next one is moving on to critical awareness. So let's break down what critical awareness means. It means knowing why it exists, how it works, how everybody is impacted by it, and who benefits from it. Critical awareness is interesting because if you are feeling alone, this is a good one to start with on any spectrum of problems. Critical awareness is really understanding how the connection between how I feel about the situation versus how the larger population feels about the situation. It's a very much a putting it into perspective and knowing you're not alone approach to this, right? So again, the first step is understanding what your shame triggers are, identifying them, and being able to recognize how hard they're hitting home for you. This second step is to understand where they come from. It's to understand who is benefiting and why it exists and who else is impacted by it. This can be looked at on a social scale, a political scale, an economic scale. There's a larger context about why shame triggers exist. I can think of parenting, for example. Like for some people are very blessed to have help with parenting, and other people aren't. And some people can feel very isolated, feeling that they don't know how to take care of their children. Whereas some people have so much help that this isn't a problem for them. But then they go, why can't you take care of your kid? And you're like, well, you have a lot more resources than I do, my friend. Anyway, that's just like an example. It's just looking at things on a larger social scale. I also call this individualizing versus contextualizing, right? An example of individualizing is, I am the only one with this problem. nobody will understand me, right? It's like I am kind of putting myself in a box. I'm putting myself in a box and not letting anybody into the box. That's individualizing. That is taking ownership of the shame. That's what puts you in the shameful cycle. Now, when you can move on to contextualizing it and understanding it on a bigger scale, it's a lot easier to understand why you would feel shame. It's kind of validating in a way. If I think about, I don't know, for me, for example, body positivity, that one, the way that my body image was a big area of shame for me. And if I could look at where it came from. For example, social media, that's one of the big ones. I know nobody likes to hear it, but yeah, I noticed that when I was on social media more, I would feel more insecure and I would nitpick and think about all the ways that I'm going to quote unquote change myself, and then I'd sit in my bed and not do anything about it. So individualizing versus contextualizing. Trying to understand that you are not the only person going through this and there is a larger problem that exists. You are not alone and other people are struggling with the same thing. So that is step number 2, is really understanding where it comes from. So let's go back through all the steps again. Step number 1 is identifying the shame and what triggers it. Step number 2 is identifying where it comes from on a larger scale, what we need to look for on that larger scale. So step number 3 is reaching out. And this is what I was kind of talking about earlier in terms of using your vulnerabilities against you. Speaking out is a hard one. Don't get me wrong. I think it's really hard reaching out is hard. When we reach out to somebody, we are putting ourselves out there. That's a huge thing. However, reaching out doesn't have to look like talking about it, right? Reaching out is supposed to be building ourselves through connections. We heal through our connections. So if we find a group of people who are feeling the exact same way, we're able to just kind of, I guess it would be like a virtual hug for me when I, would find people who were feeling the same shame as I am. It could also be a physical hug if you find community, if you find connections through a group or personal therapy, that personal one-on-one, reaching out and trying to better yourself. That's a huge one. Again, we heal ourselves through that connection. And it's one of the most important benefits to yourself and to other people, because not only are you showing them that they're not alone, but you're teaching yourself that you're not alone. That's why community is so strong and important. We are able to build off of community. Okay, so again, step number 1, shame and triggers. Where did they come? Step number 2 is where did they come from? Step number 3, reaching out, building that community, building a connection with people. The last one of shame resilience. Number 4 is speaking shame. That can be one of the hardest steps. And I can definitely identify that because this is where that invalidation can come in. This is where that vulnerability comes in. I totally get that. I'm sure a lot of people who have tried to speak their shame before have had a lot of different comments. Some of the comments that I wrote down is like, I didn't realize you were so sensitive. It's all in your head. Or one that I got a lot, I guess I'll have to watch what I say around you. Just a lot of negative comments that make you feel small, and you kind of put yourself back into that shame little cycle, right? So doing that step beforehand of reaching out is building connections with people who aren't going to put yourself in that position, right? I know, for example, for some reason, this has been coming up in my life a lot lately with just a lot of people that I've been around, but fat camp, which is so disgusting. I don't know, I've never done fat camp before, and I've never, I don't know, honestly, the therapeutic benefit of fat camp, but I've had a lot of people tell me about it. And even going there, they don't have to talk about it for people to know why they're there, right? But they're building a community in a way. So I can see why they do it, but I don't know. I'm not all for it. Anyway, so that step before is reaching out, right? I'm building that community of people, because then when I'm speaking my shame, when I feel comfortable enough to speak my shame, I'm gathered with a community that will heal me. I'm gathered around people who are feeling the same way, who can all validate each other. That makes you strong. You have power over it now, right? If we invalidate our own experiences, then we're going to start back in the shame cycle. We're going to start at step number 1, right? If somebody minimizes you, that can feel like we're starting at step number 1. Reinforcing shame can be purposeful or unintentional. It really doesn't matter, because it all hurts. If somebody is purposefully telling you shameful things or unintentionally doing it, it hurts. I hate it. It sucks. And I recognize that. That is why you have to follow the steps one by one, because if you gain that community and safety with those people, you are then putting yourself in a position to feel the power of taking control of your shame. Oh man, shame is a hard topic. So I kind of wanted to end with kind of ways that I was battling shame specifically myself, because that is one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to do this podcast next, is because I actually had an experience with this. In my first episode, I spoke about how I was feeling very, compassionate towards myself, and I've never loved myself more than I do now. And I'll give you an example of shame resilience and taking power over things and understanding my faults and gaining strength from others. So I'll take you through step by step. The first step, again, was identifying shame and triggers, right? So the shame that I'm going to be talking about today specifically is the shame. Why can't I think of it right now? Let me pull it up on my note. Oh, it's the speaking out. I spoke about that earlier. Speaking out is one of my biggest shame triggers. If I feel silenced, bitch, hold my earrings, dude. I cannot stand being silenced. I can't stand it. I've been silenced by so many disgusting people, disgusting bosses in my past, that being silenced really bothers me. And so what I do is I speak out as much as I can. I also used to not have the courage to speak out, because I felt like anytime I spoke, people would invalidate and put me down and tell me I'm wrong. That sucked. But over time, I have really learned that what I say is just as important as somebody else, right? I'm not just because somebody may be louder and prouder doesn't mean that what I say is not important. So there were things in my life specifically that I felt the need to speak up for. And because I wasn't comfortable speaking up or speaking out, because I kept getting shut down early in life, I felt pretty quiet. It wasn't until I went to grad school to become a therapist and really learned the importance of speaking out for a community of people. I have talked about how I went to Adler University before. I loved my school. It's a well-known school in Chicago, and it's a social justice school as well. It talks a lot about social justice, and it taught me a lot about speaking out and speaking for the people who can't. Here's the thing, is I had to learn the balance of speaking for them and speaking for them. Like, am I speaking over them, or am I speaking to give them respect for the people who aren't able to speak for themselves? I hope that's making sense. I hope you're following. Anyway, so speaking out was one of my biggest triggers. So I identified that. As a kid, it was really hard for me to speak out, because I felt that if I spoke out or had a different opinion, or, it was pretty like, okay, we don't talk about that. We don't, it was kind of shut down. So after that is critical awareness, speaking out, where it comes from. For me personally, there's a lot of places this came from. Questioning things was something that I couldn't do because of my previous religion. So that was something that really put me down. I also speaking out, I felt if I spoke out for people that I would be in the wrong, or that I actually didn't know what I was talking about when I did. It's, again, people were more vocal or louder than I was. I also recognize speaking out for me having a larger scale is like, I, again, don't want to be silenced. And I recognized it came from my job, one of my old jobs at least, and somebody who just silenced me and made me feel small. And so I felt shameful for speaking out, especially when it impacted like my clients or patients. And I wanted to make sure that we were doing right by them. That's what that social justice school taught me. And so I was able to kind of take power over this shame. Anyway, we're getting to that. So that's step number 2. I understand where it came from. A little bit from my childhood, a lot of it from this previous boss. It just got triggered. Therefore, I understand that anytime I feel that there's an injustice in any way in life right now, I want to fight. I'm like, no, do not talk badly about my people. Anyway, continuing onwards. The next step was the reaching out portion, gaining a community. Now, this one was hard for me because it also kind of involved a different area of shame, but I have put myself in a position over the last few years to only really have people in my life who will support me and who I trust, who have not done me wrong, which has been really painful in a lot of areas, but really rewarding. Painful to let go of some of the people who were not doing me any good, and amazing for the people in my life who I'm dedicating a lot more time to because I know that they're the people I can reach out to for support. Reaching out also looked like going to therapy. Every therapist should have a therapist. Just saying. Reaching out and trying to understand myself in therapy. Reaching out and building a connection with different interests I have, such as, I hate to say it, but book talk, right? I love reading books, and book talk is one of those. I love reading books. Reaching out and building a community of people you feel safe around. That's a big thing. So not only reaching out to my therapist, but also to a lot of the peers that were in my cohort who I could rely on, who were, I guess some people don't know what a cohort is. A lot of people who were in my grad school class with me. There we go. And also my friends. Those were really important for reaching out. Again, we heal through our connections with others. So as I let go of the people who were putting me in a more vulnerable, negative, reinforced headspace, I let them go, and I focus on the people who were uplifting me and helping me heal. I felt so much better. And then that made me be able to do the last step, which is number 4, speaking shame. When this shame trigger got triggered for me last week in particular, I got into that bitch hold my earrings mode again because I was afraid. I was wanting to stand up for my peers. I've learned also through myself, through this work of trying to understand speaking up and speaking out for people around me. And this is getting personal, guys. I have a desire to save people, even if they don't need me to save them, and they have the capability of saving themselves. And so when my people tell me they're struggling, again, that connection of people that, feel like they can't speak out, hold my earrings. I can't stand it. I just want to protect them. I want them to know that, I'm here for you. I got your back. But that also doesn't mean I'm speaking out for them. It means I'm just with them. So it got triggered because I felt that they had an injustice done to them. But in the process, I learned that they have a voice just as much as I do. And I'm putting myself in fire for speaking out. And it wasn't like a racial thing. It wasn't anything more than just one of my people are hurting and I want to speak out for them because I thought an injustice was done on behalf of them. But they had the ability to do it themselves, and I don't need to save everybody. That was my resilient factors. So after I was able to recognize that and really think through it, I was able to understand where I was getting triggered and be like, okay, so speaking out feels shameful to me because I was shut down when I spoke out for my peer who was, I felt injustice, and they put me down. The person, I'm trying to be as ambiguous as I can. I spoke out. Somebody said, no, you're wrong. Do not speak out about this. And I felt shut down and pissed. And then I'm like, you know what? No, I'm never going to speak out again. Then I went into the spiral of screw everybody. I hate everybody. But that doesn't help anything either, guys. Moral of the story, shame resilience is a hard thing to work through. It is. It really is. But I gave you this example of like speaking the shame because when I spoke out about it to some of my confidants, to people in my community, they were able to help me kind of recognize and, validate what I was feeling and then tell me like, well, maybe it's because you approached it with such a fiery attitude and the other person took it offensively. And I'm like, you know what? Yeah, you're so right. You're so right. So, moral of the story. Shame resilience is so important. So important. And if you use the 4 steps of shame resilience, I guarantee you're getting one step closer to having that self-esteem that you desired, right? Some of them are layered on top of each other. Sometimes you need to fix one area of shame resilience to be able to help the other area. And I recognize that. But when we work on becoming more resilient to those shame things and understanding what shame looks like in our life, we will be able to put ourselves in a position where, we're happier and we're feeling better about ourselves because we understand ourselves more and we don't feel as alone. Anyway, now that I'm done rambling and I got through this podcast, also this podcast was a one-hit wonder. Even though there were parts that I'm making fun of myself, I'm not cutting those out because that's just authentically me. Anyway, thank you guys so much for listening to the podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Please follow along on social media. The podcast's Instagram page is authenticityspeakspod. My personal account on TikTok is it's Tris0, but when I say personal, that's like my social media where everybody can follow me about the pod, about everything. Authenticity Speaks Pod. I did not want to create a TikTok account for it because that's just too confusing. You can also follow it's Tris0. I think I just said that. Oh yeah, it's Tris0 on Instagram as well if you want to know a little bit more about what I am up to personally, not related to the podcast. You can listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. I don't know about all of these network things. Again, I'm just a baby podcaster at this point. So I don't have a podcast network. I just bought the rights to my own music and am going forward with that. My sister and I's podcast, Tea and Catch Up, about pop culture and political news is coming soon. So keep listening for that. I'm praying we do an episode this weekend, and just get on the roll with that. But if not, keep looking out for it. Anyway, thank you guys so much for listening, and I'll see you next Wednesday. Bye.